Okay, we left off in Isaiah 9, verses 2 through 7, once again speaking of the kingdom that was coming, and there will be no end to the increase of his government of peace. And so we finished that, and a lot of Isaiah, a lot of the Old Testament, a lot of the prophecies throughout the Old Testament are talking about this coming kingdom. And so in Isaiah, we've got the contrast of the hope of the coming kingdom and all of the judgment that's coming because of the waywardness of the people. And it's not the waywardness just of Israel and Judah, but also of Assyria and Moab and Babylon and Egypt. And there's so many that are talked about. But in chapter 9 here, and you'll hear me say this a lot because it's in here a lot, in verse 9 it says, it's talking about the Lord's judgment against Israel. It says, "And all the people know it, that is Ephraim and the inhabitants of Samaria, asserting in pride and in the arrogance of heart." Once again, we looked at Isaiah 2, and it talked about when the kingdom comes that God was going to bring down the pride of man, the arrogance of man. And here, once again, throughout the book of Isaiah, that was a common theme over and over again, is bringing down the pride and arrogance and haughtiness of the people. God's judgment consistently is against that. And that's consistent with the whole Bible as we look at it. And Jesus said, the meek or the humble shall inherit the earth. And so we've mentioned that before. That's just a common theme through here. So it's a problem from the beginning. Adam and Eve, there was a problem with pride there. God said, don't do this. And they kind of thought, well, does God really know? Satan tempted them with that, and they fell into that. Satan's fall, as we'll look at here in a little bit, it tied in with pride and arrogance, haughtiness. The end of the age, it looks like, the ultimate man's haughtiness and pride and all he is and all he thinks he is. And it seems to be that a lot of that pride and arrogance comes about as there's this inordinate focus on self. We just think, we start looking at ourselves and, well, hey, I did this, I accomplished this. We see that over and over again in the scriptures. We see it we saw it with Nebuchadnezzar, thinking, hey, I built this kingdom. Hey, I did this. And there always has to come this time of humbling. Well, the judgment at the end of the age, which Isaiah covers so often, is tied in with this bringing down the arrogance and humility and pride of man. So the whole end of the age judgment is tied into that. When we look into chapter 10, there's this other theme that's consistent in the scriptures is there's judgment coming, but there's a prophetic hope. There's a remnant that'll come back. God's going to restore. And there's this prophetic hope, even when things look so horrible. I think something that I saw just a few months ago was that it seems like God equates his glory with raising things from the dead. Now, when he talked about Lazarus, and specifically in the New Testament, he said, if you believe, you will see the glory of God. And the glory in that situation was he was going to raise Lazarus from the dead. Well, I think the glory in like the nation of Israel here, and in Israel and Judah, when I speak of Israel, I'm talking about both here, is that one day the Lord will restore them. He'll raise them as if from the dead. And so many people emphasize today that God's done with this people. They've forsaken him. Look, he's cast them off. Except for the fact we get into the New Testament in Romans 11, and it says they're enemies in regards to the gospel, but he says, but they're beloved for the sake of the fathers. And then it says the gifts and calling of God are irrevocable or without repentance. That God's not going to change his calling upon Israel. It's irrevocable. His gifts and calling are irrevocable. And what is that calling? Well, it's a calling that they would be his people. They would be his covenant people. And we'll see some of those promises in the restoration ideas even in Isaiah back here. And Isaiah 10, verse 20, it's talking about a remnant. Now it will come about in that day that the remnant of Israel and those of the house of Jacob who have escaped will never again rely on the one who struck them, but will truly rely on the Lord, the Holy One of Israel. Here it looks like there's this coming back of Israel, back to the land, back as God's people, and there's a restoration, kind of a revival takes place in the nation, so that they're not looking to man anymore, but they're looking to God. And so we see that theme, and that's going to be a theme, the prophetic hope, the expectation of fulfillment, the expectation of God's blessing that's coming. We like to quote the prophet Jeremiah and say, I know the plans I have for you, a future and a hope. And that is one of the prophecies that we'll look at in Jeremiah. And of course, that comes right on the heels of talking about great judgment that happens. So, and then so the judgment gets done, but God has a time of restoration. And so we see that as a consistent theme. When we look at chapter 11 of Isaiah, this is really a real specific prophetic statement here. Now this one's one that's been used a lot for good reason, because it's so specific. In verse 1 it says, "Then a shoot will spring forth from the stem of Jesse, and a branch from his roots will bear fruit." And so here's that promise that this coming Messiah King, this one that's going to come as the rescuer, will be from the root of Jesse, from the shoot of Jesse, from his roots. And who is Jesse? Well, he was the father of David. And most of the prophecies regarding the coming Messiah will talk about David's seed. And even we see when Jesus was walking the earth, they say, "Hey, son of David." And so they related it to David, not so much to Jesse. But here it goes all the way back to, and it says, out of Jesse's, a branch will come out of his roots. And so it goes on to say in verses 2 and on there, it says, "And the Spirit of the Lord will rest on him." The Spirit of, it says the Spirit of the Lord. There's one mention of the Spirit. Then the Spirit of wisdom and understanding, it begins to break it down. The Spirit of counsel and strength, the Spirit of knowledge and of the fear of the Lord. And so this is often called just the seven spirits, the seven Spirit of the Lord kind of culmination. The seven spirits are the, how would you say it, the explanation or the definition of the sevenfold Spirit of God. And it's broken down as the Spirit of the Lord, Spirit of wisdom, understanding, counsel, strength, knowledge, and the fear of the Lord. And all of those are to be basically resting upon this one individual, this root of Jesse, and that one that would be who we would call the Messiah. He will delight in the fear of the Lord, and he will not judge by what his eye sees, nor make a decision by what his ears hear. That's verse 3. Verse 4, "But with righteousness he will judge the poor, and decide with fairness for the afflicted of the earth, and he will strike the earth with the rod of his mouth. With the breath of his lips he will slay the wicked. Also the righteousness will be the belt about his loins, and faithfulness the belt about his waist. And the wolf will dwell with the lamb, and the leopard will lie down with the kid, and the calf and the young lion and the fatling together, and a little boy will lead them." A very famous passage here in Isaiah 11. In fact, I just heard recently there was a young Jewish man asking his rabbi if Jesus was the Messiah. And the rabbi just said, no, he couldn't possibly be the Messiah because the wolf did not lay down with the lamb. And so they take this and they understand this is the Messianic passage, depiction of who the Messiah will be. What we would believe is that there's going to be two phases of the Messiah's coming. The one he came to redeem us from our sin, and the one he became a sacrifice. And then there'll come this one where he actually does establish his kingdom on the earth. And that's the one they were looking for, because that prophecy is throughout. So that just all of the prophets, the Old Testament, it's alluded to that there's going to be this kingdom. The son of David would sit on the throne. He would rule from Jerusalem. So we see it over and over again. So the expectation when Jesus came of the Jewish people was they were looking for this coming king. They were looking for a redeemer king. They were looking for someone who would drive out the Romans and give them freedom, where they would be the head and not the tail. And so all these passages about the Messiah that are here, and this one gets real specific, and it even talks about the wolf and the lamb laying down together. It goes on in verse 7. It says, "And the cow and the bear will graze, their young will lie down together, and the lion will eat straw like the ox, and the nursing child will play by the hole of the cobra, and the weaned child will put his hand on the viper's den. They will not hurt or destroy in all my holy mountain, for the earth will be full of the knowledge of the Lord as the waters cover the sea. Then it will come about in that day that the nations will resort to the root of Jesse, who will stand as a signal for the peoples, and his resting place will be glorious." So that's a summing up of that whole prophecy about the Messiah, and it sums it up with both there's the judgment, there's the establishment of this new kingdom, even when there's such peace that these animals that would be adversaries are lying down together, and there's not going to be this war stuff that's going on. There's not going to be hurt, and there's not going to be destruction, but the earth is going to be filled with the knowledge of the glory of the Lord as the waters cover the sea.